Well, our second panel of the day will tackle the dangers of biotech, biological warfare agents, and biotech innovation. Addressing these issues requires focus not only from the intelligence community, but also development of national and international strategies, consensus on laws, standards, and authorities. We've got an awesome group to shed some light on these issues, moderated by my good friend Frank Sesno at George Washington University, Dr. Charles, the Honorable Senator Joe Lieberman, who we're thrilled to be able to get back on campus, and Dr. William Roper. So over to you guys. Thank you, Frank.
Yes. Well, good morning, everyone. We are delighted to, well, I think we're delighted to be here after we have the conversation. It might not be such a delight, but no, I think it will be. And it's one that I think we're all looking forward to. And I thought maybe what we would do before we actually dive into the topic itself is to connect each of you with the topic area and your areas of interest and focus. So Charles, you're a bioscientist with the CIA. What else can you tell us about what you do on a daily basis?
Okay, well, I'm a scientist who explains scientific concepts and technology to non-scientists. So I don't actually practice science in a lab anymore, but I use my skills and background to write and communicate to the policymakers we need to provide warning to about the implications of those technologies.
With a focus on
national security. My area is in biological weapons, and my background is in virology, microbiology.
Senator Lieberman, we all know you from your many incarnations, campaigns, but you've had, throughout your career, a very serious focus on national security. And now, in fact, we'll talk about this, you're also focused on biological crimes and terrorism. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Good. Thanks, Frank. I just thinking, as Charles said, he was teaching science to non-scientists. When I went to college, there was still a science requirement, but they had a special track of science for non-science majors. And just because
I did one of those too. It was called something like physics for the intimidated.
Yeah. So I took a course, half the year was astronomy, half geology, and of course we called it rocks and stars, or stars and rocks. Anyway, so for the last 3 years, I've been privileged to co-chair with former Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge a blue ribbon study panel, bipartisan, on biodefense. This was not created by the executive or congressional branches of our government. It sprang up because of concerned individuals, particularly centered at a think tank in town called the Hudson Institute. And they asked Tom and me to chair it. And well, I was happy to do it because I've been involved in national and homeland security. I always have worried about the threat of both terrorist attacks, but also the very related, in some senses similar, risk of infectious disease pandemics, which we probably won't talk about much today. So for the last 3 years, we've done a series of reports, and unfortunately the conclusion is that the threat of both bioterrorist attack and infectious disease epidemics is real and growing, and our government is not organized to protect us adequately from it.
And we will talk about all that. Will Roper, I was trying to find the most interesting profile of you, and I think I did, from Fox News not too long ago. Roper's resume reads like a character backstory from The Big Bang Theory. Graduated summa cum laude from Georgia Tech with a master's degree in physics, earned a doctorate in mathematics at Oxford, a Rhodes Scholar, Truman Scholar, received a presidential commendation for founding and directing a tutoring program that served 400 Georgia schools. Oh, and Roper is a published poet and essayist, second degree in black belt, taekwondo, and has performed in a chamber choir.
You know, it's interesting the day the Secretary of Defense tells the world what you do. Because for a long time, the job that I do in the Defense Department was not something that we could talk about publicly. And so I'll be very interested to discuss that with you today, especially as it applies to biology. It's very interesting when you're brought out from behind the door and there is no paper trail about you online, and you get a news article that kludges together your 18-year-old college self, because there still is a description on the internet, with your 38-year-old modern self. So very much a Frankensteining of the two worlds. But my job in the Pentagon is very simple. It's to get the department ready for the next war. Been a lot of special efforts over the past decade to deal with terrorism, and that's not going away. But we haven't done a lot of thinking about how to get a military that has been relatively predictable but unstoppable over the last 25 years, how to get it ready to deal with modern competition, modern warfare. And bio comes into that very strongly, because it is a new kid on the block. It is not something that has been at this level of maturity, with this level of investment from private sector, from medical research, that could create new strategic effects for foreign governments, foreign countries, that don't have the same ethics standards that we have. So my fear in bio is that we're going to be playing defense while the rest of the world may choose to play offense, and defense is always harder, so we'll have to start earlier.
So let's dive in. The issue of the bio threat, it really reflects a two-sided coin. It, in many cases, is a direct result of the opportunities, the breakthroughs that come from biotechnology and biodiscovery. I'd just very quickly like to ask each of you, when you think about biotechnology, where do you see the greatest breakthroughs? Before we go to the perils, I'm just interested in what you see as the opportunities.
I think, speaking broadly, if we look at the news and we see the genome editing headlines and whatnot, those approaches potentially enable the creation of a lot of animal models to study diseases and pathogenesis in ways we couldn't do before because we had inadequate model systems. And those models, I mean, scientists need models to test hypotheses and to basically make new discoveries. Those models have been lacking. I mean, there were a few, but they weren't as good. But now with these genome editing tools, we have the potential to really improve our ability to A, make the models, and B, make the model systems faster. And that'll enable the experimentation to occur to build that pyramid of knowledge and science that can be misused, but can also be used for great things.
Senator?
Let me say a word about the two sides of the coin first. This is obviously not new in human history.
Right.
We've got a long track record of people taking advances that improve the way they live and then using them for warfare or some other adverse. I mean, you can go back to the creation of fire, which enabled people to do a lot that they couldn't do before, but also enabled them to hurt each other in different ways. And you can take it right through to today's headlines with the extraordinary growth of information technology, social media. Now we find that a hostile country has used Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, to try to control our elections. Pretty amazing. And unnerving. So we're dealing here with a problem that the human race has faced before. But as answers have suggested, biotechnology revolution is moving not only to different areas, but rapidly, incredibly rapidly. Also beginning to use information technology, cyberspace. So what are the really great potentials? Great potentials, I mean, this, in some ways you could say this is going to be the century of biotechnology. Positively speaking, things will happen as a result of biotechnology that will cure diseases that are shortening our lives, that will enable us to live better in many ways. I'll just use a quick example of the infectious disease pandemic fear. You can imagine a case. Well, you know, next year is the 100th anniversary of the influenza epidemic of 1918. Between 50 and 100 million people died in that epidemic, pandemic. And we weren't anywhere near as globalized. So now biotechnology offers the promise, just as was said, through genomic sequencing, editing, et cetera, synthetic developments, that you could step in quickly, try to figure out a medical countermeasure. So, I mean, that's the bright side of all this, and it's quite bright.
Well,
What excites me is that anytime you've got two fields that have not overlapped before, that's exciting. It's just exciting as a reformed scientist that now has to be a government bureaucrat. I would love to be at the intersection of biology and computer science, which is what gene editing represents. I would love to be at the intersection of biology and design-based engineering, which is what some of the recent Nobel Prize in chemistry was given for the ability to be able to image molecules at the sub-molecule level, at the atomic level. So that would be exciting to be a researcher. And you'll have people working together that haven't worked together before. Biologists who don't understand computer science and computer scientists who don't understand biology. And that's the exciting bit. I think it will accelerate research. There will be greater leap aheads on scientific fronts. The scary side is that we're going to be producing data, new results, new technologies, new findings at a rate that policy and governments won't be able to keep up with. And it goes back to the earlier point. If we're primarily playing defense on this, and the U.S. will be, then defense means we're going to have to be better, faster, stronger than any foreign government that may be tempted to make modern biological weapons or future biological weapons the next class of strategic weapon. So I worry because I find that the U.S. government's not good about recognizing a long-term trend, are these slow-ticking clocks that are eventually going to go off, and making sound investments over time to get ahead of them.
so if we think about some of the biotechnology breakthroughs, we know that they have led to vaccines, hundreds of them that have been developed or are in development, much more rapidly through the digitization of biology. I was talking with a food expert the other day who was talking about taking literally a gene from a camel and putting it into rice so that it needs less water. I said, well,
It's logical.
Little humpy rice, but you know. But these same technologies and breakthroughs are more available to more people as all this effort is going on. So what I want to ask you as we turn to the threat side of this, with the proliferation of these technologies and access to the data and the information around them, how much more vulnerable are we, and to what?
Well, I can address one element of that question in the sense that while technology is becoming more democratized or available, what you have to marry up with that is a knowledge base and a skill set to actually use the technology in a way that you want to use it, to achieve some outcome. And scientists have the ability to troubleshoot problems in biology that aren't just something you find on the internet. There's a certain level of empirical, tacit knowledge that comes with being a scientist that does temper what you're saying a little bit. But on the flip side, yeah, it's true that as these knowledge and approaches proliferate, that discoveries made in medicine could be picked up by a bioweaponeer in some dark corner that we don't know about. To do anything really limited by the creativity of the individual who's applying to some end.
What's a scenario, Will?
There's a variety of things to worry about, and I think that's why it's tough for us to pull the trigger on getting started, is what's the top priority. Right. I could imagine bad actors in future saying, I would like to edit your genome, not in a way that's going to do anything today, but in a way that's going to let me coerce you into acting the way that I want. So basically, a long ticking clock, or a long fuse bit of TNT that I know is going to go off, that's going to be a huge psychological impactor of you. And that would be a strategic class of weapon, in my opinion. I worry about artificial biology, right? So I worry about taking biological mechanisms that have been evolving for billions of years that are well adapted to live in the world around us, and giving them features that would never or likely never happen unless we get in and influence them, and not being able to contain a potential like leak or contamination. So the whole idea of how to do research will change when you start mixing the artificial and the real. And I think biological machines are interesting. That seems to be where
machines.
Biological machines. That's where a lot of recent research is going, and trying to be able to see the basic mechanical mechanisms that make molecules work. That's what the recent Nobel Prize were given about. So we're really where our Stone Age counterparts were, is we're trying to find wheels and levers and pulleys, but not at the stone level. We're trying to find them at the molecular or atomic level. And once we're able to engineer with those, maybe future militaries have huge components that you can't even see. And so we're back to offense is always going to be easier than defense. And so if that's a possibility in the not too far future, then it needs some strategic investment to make sure that we're not caught off guard.
But before we go on, and Senator, I want to come to you in just a minute, but your job is to imagine future wars, right? So when you're thinking about that, what does that future war that you're thinking about look like?
So I think let me play what a foreign country, not the U.S., could do. So I might decide, as opposed to going into nuclear weapons, which I may decide are too difficult for me to make or too costly, or that I don't have that technical research bed in-house, I might decide to go down this biological path because it may be cheaper, faster, and I could always couch it under the auspices of medical research. Right. You have to think, you're one step away, right? Fixing yourself, you're one step away from hurting yourself. So I worry about that because it's a kind of development that would be hard to put your finger on it and say that is purely for mal purposes, because there would always be the flip side, as the senator teed up. I worry about that kind of future. I worry about a future where there's significant human performance enhancement, which again, we will have lots of ethical barriers in the US, but other countries won't. And how do we have our operators, as awesome as they are, it's one of the great privileges of this job is getting to work with our operators, and why I go to work every day, despite all of the things to worry about. But I don't like the idea of them going against a deck that's continually stacked against them because of enhancements. So I think those are the first areas that you'll see people think are appealing. I think the artificial biology and the biological machines will be a step beyond. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be worrying about them and investing to deal with their consequences.
Senator.
Well, just to really, right now, we have a pretty good reason to believe that countries that don't wish us well have biological warfare capacity. Certainly you could name the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Syrians we know. So the short-run danger here that we've talked about in our own investigations is that, and non-state actors who have been very clear, terrorists, been very clear that they are working on biological warfare capacity, probably at a level that is relatively primitive compared to what we've just been talking about, but still capable of doing a lot of damage and taking a while for us to detect. Beyond that, I was thinking as I was listening to my colleagues that I spent a fair amount of time on cybersecurity the last 4 or 5 years I was in the Senate. And what was clear to me is that, this is no surprise to anybody in this room, we were way ahead in our offensive cyber capacities. Mm-hmm. We were way behind in our defensive capacities. And I think that's where we are now in terms of the misuse of biotechnology. We still invest more in biotechnology than any country, most of it from the private sector, but a lot of it assisted by a government. But we don't invest hardly anything in coordinated defense to the misuse of biotechnology. And obviously there are other countries, including China particularly, both for commercial and potentially belligerent uses, that are investing a lot of money in biotechnology.
Let me ask you about something that was quite controversial and notable at the time. And this is a piece from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists that I pulled this from, when the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, testified about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, about genetic editing. The headline here, how genetic editing became a national security threat. Director of National Intelligence James Clapper sent shockwaves through the national security biotechnology community with his assertion in his worldwide threat assessment testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee that genome editing had become a global danger. He went so far as to include it in the report's weapons of mass destruction section. He said that since the discovery of the double helix and all the rest, biotechnology has made progress exceeding that of arguably any other technology in human history. Biotech is a weapons of mass destruction?
No, I think the statement is leaning towards biological weapons or future biological weapons could become the next strategic class of weapon. The way that when nuclear weapons were first made, we realized these are very different than a conventional bomb. And what's different about them, and what I think will be scary to think about policies and laws to govern them, is that this is a strategic weapon that in many cases you could reverse the effect of, that you could pull the trigger and then unpull the trigger. And I think that means that there are strategic weapons that will have more appeal or more likelihood of use.
Now, what are you talking about exactly?
So if you can edit a genome to put in things that are harmful for the person or people that are targeted, then in theory you can undo those. You've got the poison and the antidote. And the way that a nuclear weapon has no antidote. Once you pull the trigger, you have to deal with the consequences, and those consequences are dire. So it's the scalability, it's the tailorability, it's the reversibility of the strategic effect that I think will be very difficult and challenging for us, because it will feel like it has the effect of weapons that you can't take back, but it will have that take-back ability. And that means we're going to need to think hard about what that means for warfare, and we are. But to think hard about what it means for warfare, you have to keep up with the science. And to the point earlier, a lot of the Defense Department is well trained in things that we built in the past century. So how radars work and sensors work and fighters work and stealth works and submarines work. But I don't think we're pushing people hard in biology. We're not pushing people hard in computer science.
Well, and you can detect these things. It will be much more difficult, right, to detect some genome editing that could create a highly virulent pathogen.
Right, these would be essentially invisible. I mean, I'm using a layman's term here. To some extent, it's just the next step. It's not really related, but it will be with the unconventional threats we're facing in our time. I mean, we're most fearful today in many ways, not of traditional attacks by planes and battleships, et cetera, but by enemies that sort of walk up to people at a train station in Marseille and knife them, or fly planes into World Trade Center, et cetera. And this will be terrifying because it will be essentially invisible. And we have some programs now, one called BioWatch. Our panel's conclusion is it's way beneath what we need to create a system in which we can accurately detect and attack as it's going on. Honestly, Frank, to go back to what you said, it's just looking at history, thinking about the enormous potential for biotechnology use for bad purposes. It's not hard to imagine in the not too distant future for want of a better term, I'd call a biotechnology arms race. And we're not really ready for it yet.
So, Charles, as a scientist, and one of the perennial issues that comes up, right, is regulation of science and surveillance of breakthrough. And there have been discussions about conventions and various ways to do that. There's been huge pushback from the scientific community. How do we make sense of this, and what do we need from the perspective of your watch in national security?
I think balance is important.
What does that mean?
The balance between the concern of accidents, if you're doing experiments that are perhaps, on the edge while you're studying disease processes or infectious disease in particular. The flu research that was done a few years ago on transmissibility in ferrets with avian influenza really kicked off a lot of these discussions in this regard, that we call the dual-use research of concern issue. And that's something that's kind of flooded through the scientific community as a buzz phrase. But there are real concerns there. There are some experiments to answer questions in pathogenesis research that you might need to do that are a little risky, but they would enable you to better understand, well, what makes this virus particularly transmissible? How can we develop a better intervention against that? And so how do you balance that against the needs for security is a challenge. I wouldn't claim that I have an answer to that, but it's something that needs to be thought out pretty carefully, because you don't want to hinder your own defense in the process.
But not to make the problem overly dire, I mean, the solution to these ills, we've already mentioned, that there's going to be a huge emphasis on making new biotech the next medicine at a gene level and at a small nano level. And so I see a lot of hope if the government starts encouraging startups who are trying to work in this business to work on things like gene monitoring that can be done inexpensively by people at home, especially if that same monitoring has a lot of medical applications. So the dual use of the technology is a strength if we have a national strategy for how to interleave medical research and make sure that we're not blind on the things that we're going to need for national security applications. But the vision for most companies in this research is that eventually this biotech is cheap enough that you're doing it at home on a routine basis. And that's why there's hope for being able to detect these type of attacks in future, as long as we're pushing the detection capability and the response capability faster than its ill uses.
This is a perfect setup, Senator Lieberman, to the Blue Ribbon Study Panel that you participated in that had a gathering just yesterday.
Yes.
And the document, Blue Ribbon Study Panel, U.S. not prepared to identify perpetrators of biological crimes, terrorism, proliferation, and warfare.
Yeah.
Aside from that, Mrs. Lincoln enjoyed the show.
Right.
But
Sorry.
right? But,
Yeah.
So having these surveillance models and be able to bring this to the home, that's a good thing. That's like using social media to make us safer. We also know that there's a flip side to that. Of course. What did your study panel find?
Well, so yesterday's session, just part of our ongoing work, was on attribution. So let's say we have pretty good reason to believe that a bioterrorist attack has occurred. It's important for our government to be able to figure out, obviously, first, you want to treat people, and a whole set of other questions about whether our public health system is really prepared to do that adequately. But then you want to find out, to the best of your ability, who did it. This also has parallels.
Well, you need to find that out fast because you need to know what else they have and what else they're planning to do, right?
What else they're planning to do, and in a way, one of the members of our panel, who's a former prosecutor, approached this from a criminal law perspective, which is reasonable. You got to hold people accountable, and how are you going to deter it from happening again? But the probably more relevant questions will be, in the case of a bioterrorist attack, can you gather enough information to tell the National Command Authority, the president, who did this, and then to enable the president to be able to decide how to respond?
Are we prepared for this?
No. We have some capacity, and there's a lot of people thinking about it, working about it. There's some groups, both at defense and state. Incidentally, the intelligence community, we haven't talked about this. This is CIA part sponsored in a way. This is a world of science, complicated. But honestly, once again, we're going to need a whole level of intelligence here that will be just critical. I mean, without it, we won't be able to rapidly deter. It's not going to be easy, but we need to be into hostile parties' labs or whatever, businesses even. I mean, we just have to be gathering information so we know who's taken the turn from good biotechnology to bad.
Charles, you want to jump in on that?
And what I would add to the senator's comments is you face a sort of a multifaceted challenge in an attribution scenario following some biological attack, right? You may have some evidence to analyze that might be microbiological in nature. And the way you analyze that to contribute to an attribution investigation might be fraught with some scientific challenges that just hadn't been answered yet because people hadn't thought about that particular problem set. They don't give grants in that area. You know, grants are biology focused in human health and other areas. So that's one element, but I would also caution that it's not merely the analysis of microbiological evidence per se that would give you attribution. It's part of a larger picture, a puzzle, if you will, of other pieces of information. If you could think of it as a traditional whodunit kind of problem. Well, you have, other intelligence sources you can rely on. You have the analysis of the physical evidence to generate leads for an investigation and prime the intelligence community to look under rocks maybe we haven't looked under yet. All those things contribute to that puzzle. But I think in the area of the scientific challenges, there are a lot of questions that are unanswered for how do you do analysis of particular types of evidence. What does comparison of viral sequences buy you? You could certainly sequence a lot of things and determine a lot of differences, but can you make comparisons that are meaningful that lead to a trail back to a potential perpetrator's
Yeah,
lab?
I agree.
I mean, those are difficult
I
problems.
totally agree, which is why I ended up talking about the importance of intelligence, which is a way to sort of have an early warning or at least some base of information in the case of an attack where you can go back and look at potential sources of that attack based on intelligence more than actually what happened in the attack.
I'm going to come to your questions, audience questions, in just a couple of minutes. So, Will, I know you want to jump in.
Yeah, Frank, I think the key is what do we incentivize in the government? So this research is going to have broad funding from venture capitalists because there's going to be huge payback in medicine.
Already does.
Already does, right? It's going to continue to have it as long as it
And it's going to be
continues
global.
Global.
It's going to be done by multinational corporations that cross borders.
So my view is that what the government can do when most of the money being spent isn't government money is to try to create lanes or channels where outside money flows faster, gets to results, gets to profitability earlier. And my opinion on this is we ought to be going all in on early detection of any of these three big veins we've talked about for gene editing, for artificial biology, or for biological machines. That we will not be able to build a wall to keep it out. That's a different kind of technological approach. In my view, that's probably a dead end before you even begin. But we saw the trend happen in the last century when cancer went from being basically a death sentence to something that's very survivable because we shift emphasis for early detection, which allowed better treatment options to come forward. I predict the analog is going to happen here, but we need to incentivize the investments in industry that will give us that detection. And then we need cultural awareness for what this means, and that means a government that is much, much smarter on the science and implications of what we've been talking about.
Are you making this a priority in your job?
This is a big priority for me this year. Every year I usually take on something that is new and a wild west for the department, and this is an area that everything I read, I'm excited when I think about personal application to me in terms of living longer, living better, but then when I flip it and put my day job hat on, I worry.
But this
I worry because
as
it's
the senator said, this
long-term
is not news. But what you're saying is you are in, as we speak, in real time, raising this as a priority at the Department of Defense in your sort of...
So my goal is to get department leadership more aware, not necessarily getting them the details of the science, but telling them what the implication is and where the trend is. Because we need to make investments in our R&D funding, which is significant, right? There's 70-ish billion per year. We need to make smart choices in bio, and we may need to shift resources from areas of research in the past that are no longer beneficial.
I just want to ask you one more before we go to the floor, because you mentioned this a moment ago. What are, in your view, the actual realities of sort of real-life X-Men? These sort of augmented, genetically altered super soldiers, super athletes, run farther, jump higher, need less sleep, feel less pain. Is that something that you think about? Is that real?
I had to think about it at South by Southwest this year because someone in the audience asked, were we working on making a human swim as fast as a shark? And I told them we're not, but I would volunteer to be that person. If, and
you didn't invite them to Washington, where we have plenty of people who fit that description.
I could do the Michael Phelps gig, and I could race a real shark and be on Shark Week. So no, that's hard for me to see. That kind of not in my time frame, which is thinking about the next war. But I can think about modifications that make people more alert, that allow them to have better attention spans to deal with more data, that avoid fatigue, that avoid the need for rest immediately, that give people better stamina. And all of those things, to get those approved, to go out into the battlefield for the U.S., there is a mountain of laws and policymakers and reviews and safety checks that have to be climbed. It is one of the hardest areas of research. If you want to change the MRE, which is the meals ready to eat unit, that's harder than changing a major weapon system, in my opinion. So how we're going to do that against countries that don't have those policy implications and that may be pulling down red tape to just let the Wild West happen scares me the most. Because I don't like when the slope of development is very different between us and the rest of the world. it probably will be in biology for the foreseeable future.
Quickly, sir.
I would add one facet to that is if you look at kind of where we are now, and Will alluded to that, we're at the level of sort of pharmaceutical intervention for enhancement. And that's enabled by our understanding of various physiologic processes, right? And so as these genome editing tools enable us to build better model systems to study various things in animals where we can't ethically do experiments like that in humans, we're going to learn more. So I think the first thing you're going to see is more improvement in the pharmaceutical aspects of enhancement. Lots of science fiction authors who have written on these things too. The actual, genetically engineered individual who has the powers of the X-Men, I think, is a little far-fetched, unless you can find biological corollaries for it, right? So if you look at the X-Men characters, being a little bit of a comic book nerd myself in my past youth, characters like Storm, who can control the weather, really not a biological corollary for that. Looks great on the big screen, is kind of cool to imagine. But something like Wolverine, adamantine claws aside, he has wound healing, fast wound healing. Well, the wound healing process is obvious biological corollary. It's a well-studied process, and we still don't understand it fully. It's complex interaction, lots of cell types, extracellular matrix, all that kind of thing. But understanding that process will enable better interventions to promote faster or promote wound healing where it normally would be difficult to occur, such as severe burn cases and things along those lines. I see those types of advancements on the horizon more so than I see the superpowered super soldier of the X-Men.
I want to go to the floor and your questions. I see one over here. Our lights come up. Go ahead and get as many in as we can.
Excellent session. This is John Weiler with the IT Acquisition Advisory Council, and I appreciate the corollaries to government deficiencies in information technology. And a study of 10 years looking at the impediments, we seem to might not have been able to overcome these impediments in bureaucracy, red tape that DoD has today in ingesting commercial innovations. If we don't fix that, will the same problems impede our progress in ingesting commercial innovations in biotechnology?
Yeah, they will for sure, and also in our ability to defend ourselves. I mean, one of the things we found in our study of the current state of biodefense in the American government, you're not going to be shocked to hear this, it's disorganized. It's spread throughout the government. In fact, the government itself can't tell you how much we're spending every year on biodefense. There's no unified budget. We had to go to the group at the University of Pittsburgh to give us an estimate. So, this is talk about two sides of a coin. You mentioned before, part of what distinguishes us is we try to apply rules and values to development. So while we might be able to, I think we're going to begin to have the technological, biological capability, maybe not to produce X-Men or women, but to move in that direction. It's inevitable. There's a blurring of the ability. You can bridge the gaps between organic and inorganic material, the gene editing going on. Inevitably, some country's going to do it that doesn't worry about rules. But the other side of a rule-based society like ours is that we get in the way of each other and we get in the way of achieving our goals. And
certainly we've seen that. We're just at the Olympics, right? And looking at teams that where athletes were enhanced and others
and that's
weren't.
again
you see this collision
stuff.
of rules and another question from the floor. There we go, right in front. I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Lights are in our eyes.
My question has to do with the food change is a very sensitive aspect for daily life in any country. As yet, I don't see the FDA or any government agency doing more rigorous control, particularly in the waters, particularly on vegetables. We're having vegetables coming imported from China. We don't know what earth was those vegetables grow, what sort of fertilizer they use. So I think this bio hazard, it could come very easily in the food chain.
The food, that's interesting. Food.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's back, if we can't make the fundamental sensing unit of biological change, whether modification or artificial feature, if we can't make it cheap enough to make it an attachment to your smartphone, then we'll be vulnerable. right? Because it's tailorable and it's something that will hit all of us in our personal lives. So the fortunate thing is that that same cheapness is what the medical community want. They want to get this where you can consume this new science and where you want to do it because it improves your life. So what's really needed is a national strategy, right, to basically make that consumer investment drive and improve our lives, but not leave us with gaps on national security. And my 5 years in the government have, and that's not nearly enough compared to the senator here, but have shown me we're not very good at this kind of strategy. We're not good at grand strategies. I think this technology is going to force us to have one, though.
Just to make sure that you don't get any sleep tonight. So this is another area our panelists looked at, which is terrorist attacks on our food supply. We were actually looking at the introduction of pathogens, synthetic pathogens, into, for instance, poultry in America, which then often crosses over to humans, but also in our agricultural industry, and not even thinking about from abroad. And if you start to get into raising safety standards on food coming in, wow, just think of the screaming about globalization and we're trying to stop trade, but it is a real concern. And you know, as I studied this, I must say I'm both surprised and grateful that we haven't suffered a biological attack by terrorists yet, thank God. Because when you think about it, it's not easy, but it's relatively less daunting than other kinds of attacks they could carry out.
I worry about things like defending the food supply in future.
Yeah.
Less about the thing once grown coming in and more about attacking the genome of corn or rice or things that without them, there's no economy within any country that depends on them for their food source. And these will be things that can be attacked in future.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly, I mean, I think it was alluded to before, but as we have a convergence of biology and computer science, there then becomes the possibility of essentially hacking into the biology and distorting it to our great harm. So you can think of a lot of ways that could happen both personally and more broadly in terms of food supply.
I would add one element of hope to that, the ability to monitor the food supply for introduction of a pathogen and whatnot. One of the chief means we use now to detect things is DNA sequencing technology. And if you look at that, the commercial drivers have pushed that to faster, better, cheaper, and smaller.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, as Will alluded to, you know, if you have an attachment on your smartphone that can perform those kind of activities, we're not there yet, but if the drivers continue, that technology will become more diffuse and available to agricultural inspectors and others who can screen things, looking for things that are out of the ordinary. So there is hope on the technology front in that regard. So there are a lot of good drivers out there for that.
Another question over here. Mic is on its way.
So as someone that isn't really a scientist, my question is more on the strategy part. As major powers kind of continue to invest in biotechnology and it becomes kind of a part of the arsenal of most major powers, how do you see it being used strategically? Do you see it being kind of like nuclear weapons where it's used as more of a deterrent? Or as it's used only covertly, or do you see major powers using this technology openly to harm other people?
Well, I can address that a little bit in perhaps not directly, but how you might want to think about it. The set of questions you might want to ask and pose to people like Will at the Pentagon and other places. If an adversary wants to pursue biological weapons to add to their military toolbox, what might they want to do with it that they wouldn't be able to do with any other weapon system that would provide an advantage in a certain scenario? Then you have to kind of game that out. That's one way to approach it. And then if you do that, you start to narrow your field of the possible. Because I said earlier, you know, bio-threats are potentially limited by the creativity of the sort of unethical biologist who wants to go down that road, right? So it's difficult to anticipate.
So game that out.
So I think, and this is, again, it's predicting based on where the science is going, but I predict that there will be a class of biological weapon or capability in the future that we'll designate as strategic in nature. So fitting in the category of nuclear, of major cyber attacks, and that it creates an existential threat to the nation or nations at which it is projected. And then we'll work on policies and strategies of deterrence so that those weapons are never used, right? And how to draw that line is going to be the difficult thing. It's easy to draw for nuclear weapons. It will be hard to draw. It's hard to draw for cyber. It's hard to draw it for biological. And I think there'll be other kinds of biology, like improving our performance and improving our health, that'll be in a conventional class that we'll define as being okay.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry, we're almost out of time here. It's been a fascinating and, yes, scary conversation. We'll try to sleep this evening. But I'd like to ask you to leave us with a look ahead. What is it, do you feel, that most needs to be happening within the intelligence community and the government? Pick one thing, be brief. If we've got a scorecard and we're really going to be seeing ourselves prepare for some of these very frightening eventualities. Charles?
I think one of the areas I know we look at is how do you stay current on these technologies and imagine their implications. And part of that involves our ability as scientists within the agency to interact with academic scientists who are on the cutting edge of these things, people in industry and whatnot. If they have things that concern them, we might not have thought of that. And that's, how do you make those connections happen is an area where I think there could be improvement. Well, it's good now, but I think we could always improve there.
We need cheap, scalable detection of biological meddling that can be pushed out to individuals. And we need to encourage those investments.
Senator, we'll give you the last word.
Thanks. So based on our panel's work, I'd say that we first really need to get our act organized within the U.S. government and put somebody in charge. I mean, we recommended the vice president because we couldn't think of anybody better. It's possible you could create a position at the National Security Council to organize and then to adequately fund intelligence in this area and to continue to create a positive climate for private sector investment in biotechnology. The other thing to say at the strategic level is that there is now a biological weapons convention. People will argue that it hasn't worked very well, but the very fact that it sets a standard, it hasn't worked for everybody, but it's worked for some. And the question is, does it cover biotechnology weapons? To me, biotechnology weapon is a biological weapon, so it's covered, but I think it would be a constructive move if the U.S. would sort of open discussion about, more specifically, about the threat of biotechnology weaponization in the world through the bioweapons convention and begin to put it on the screen, at least, for civilized society.
Will we going to do that? Yes or no?
Yes, I think policies are always behind the science. We need to start having policies that we are updating more frequently, treaties that we update more frequently, because when they're made 50 years earlier, technology allows capabilities that couldn't be imagined in decades before. That's not just true in biology, that's true in many, many different fields of science.
The 9/11 Commission report says right in the beginning that what we experienced, among other things, was a failure of imagination.
Yeah.
And this is an area where we must not have a failure of imagination, as frightening as that imagination might be. Thank you very much for the conversation, for your insight. Thanks to you.
Thank you.
Have a great conference.